You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
So you went out to the wilderness. Brendan, did you find Bigfoot?
No, I did not. It was a pretty crazy trip, though. We actually planned for 2 nights, 3 days, and we ended up just doing it in 2 days. It's a 26-mile loop, a few thousand feet of elevation. And yeah, the main reason for that was you need there's a ridiculous permit system in Oregon. It's terrible. But we kind of knew we didn't have one of the permits we needed, and we ran into a ranger on the way up to the very top. And he's like, yeah, just don't stay here another night. So we ended up just finishing the whole entire thing, which was cool. Great trip. I learned a lot of lessons. And yeah, I'm ready for the next one. I think we're doing K2 next. I don't know if you've heard of that mountain.
I'd heard it's a bit of a walk, that one. You should probably set your sights a little bit higher.
Yeah.
But while you start training for K2, before that, we're going to talk a little bit this week about the art of defense. So not the art of the hike, Brendan, or the art of the walk, or the art of the climb. It's the art of defense. We had a great question a while ago about when to defend and when not to defend in Flesh and Blood. And it's a pretty integral part of the game, right? Might be slipping away a little bit in some aspects. But today we are going to go over, I guess, some key concepts and some things that can give you some edges, give you some percentages, things to remember to gain just a few little points here and there that can add up to some pretty big wins over the course of the game. So looking forward to that. We also have a great Command and Cookout question that we're going to get to as well, Brendan. But before then, I guess, how was your week in Flesh and Blood, if you did play any Flesh and Blood this week?
Almost non-existent. I played before I went out, but I haven't. We only played a little bit post-ban, and then I went on my trip. So, yeah, took a bit of a break from Flesh and Blood, but that's because I knew that there would be a grind time when I came back. So, looking now at these kind of future 2 weeks we have before we head out to Lille to sort of lock in on a deck, ideally lock in on a deck this week and then work on game plans. Maybe lock in on 2 decks, right? Because there is a bit of meta dependency on what deck we will pick, but lock in on game plans, figure out sideboards, and then really look at the data from other tournaments prior to the Pro Tour to, maybe sway us this way or that way. Because, Singapore beforehand, some of the battle hardens. There's a lot of information you can utilize to pick your deck for Pro Tour number 2.
Reading between the lines, Brendan, it really feels like the ban came last week, and you were hit so hard, and such an emotional reaction for you that you just had to walk away and go into the forest for 5 days. Is that just coincidence or intentional?
I just couldn't be around the internet. I couldn't think about those freaking stubby hammers. I had to go just sit in the wilderness and ponder. And now that I've come back, I did post on Twitter. I had a bit of a clairvoyance, a moment per se, and I've locked on Saber Bolton, everybody. That is my deck for Pro Tour number 2.
And along with your Azalea deck that you always love to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, tell you what, I just spent the week testing, trying to get in some sessions where I could, ramping up a little bit. I fly out earlier than you do, Brendan, so I'm off to Singapore when the pod drops in 4 days. So haven't got long now, but then of course once we get to Lille on the Tuesday before the Pro Tour, do have 2 or 3 days with Brendan and Sasha to just work through some things and work out, like you say, sideboard plans, game plans, what we want to play for the PT. Hoping to get in another last few drafts this weekend, time permitting. And yeah, that's kind of been the week in Flesh and Blood. Did I play an event? I feel like I played I went to a 1K event here in Sydney on Sunday, which was awesome. Really well run by a store called Grimdark Gaming. They're my first time down there. They're about sort of like an hour 20 minutes from me. So a bit of a drive, but I wanted to get in some CC, and I've heard so much about the store, so I really wanted to get down and play there. Had an awesome time, awesome experience. Had a direct rematch of my Nationals final, and I lost this time, Brendan. I got taken out by an Ultim, and by exactly the same player that I played in the finals at Australian Nationals, getting his revenge, taking me down. So
did he attack you this time?
He definitely did attack me.
Okay.
So no, we had a good game, good day all round. It was quite late by the time I got home, so it was a big day for a Sunday, but managed to get that in last sort of, I guess, event before calling in the PT. But no, all good stuff. Brendan, news. quiet week this week. I mean, not a lot of things happening. The lull before the storm, or the calm before the storm, I guess, before we head into Battle Hard in Portland this week, calling Singapore the following weekend, and then of course the big one, Pro Tour and the calling in Lille. It's all about to go down. We've of course had the ban restricted announcement. We now have 3 weeks of events around the world. And then we head into national season, which is crazy. So we get a ban restricted announcement on the 30th, right? So I just want to remind everyone of that. We have a scheduled ban restricted announcement on the 30th of August following the conclusion of the Lille weekend. And then we head into national season. So it's going to be a pretty full on time. But otherwise, nothing really to report on this week. Did just want to, of course, give a big call out to all of our patrons. If you're not familiar with our Patreon, we do deck guides up there that go along with all our deck techs on YouTube. We do an additional monthly podcast where we dive into things that we might not feel fits the main channel and sort of small level up topics and things like that, as well as just any extra content that we throw up over the time, whether it be sort of like gameplay reviews or draft sheets, things like that. So,
well, I'll tell you, Hayden. While I was in Oregon,
oh,
you already know. He's already sniffing it out of me. Yeah, we climbed to the top of this mountain. We stopped the first night at Green Lakes. We got there at around 8 p.m. and it's just such a wild concept to me that in the wilderness there's like these like pre-established campsites, but they're not really campsites. But then they would put the closed sign on them, which was the most ridiculous. So I was getting wrecked by mosquitoes. Sun was setting, freezing cold, and we got to find a spot. But once we find it, we also got to make some food, which means we got to whip up our own little command and cook out there. I had my dehydrated chicken and rice, which was delicious. And then I proceeded to lay in my sleeping bag and freeze my butt off until about 3 a.m., in which I fell asleep and then woke back up at 5 a.m. But it was good. It was a good barbecue on the Bunsen burner that night. So why don't you take us into this week's barbecue, which is a command and cookout question from TJB.
Yep, you can hear all the world's smallest violins playing for you, Brendan.
I was loving it. What do you mean?
It's pretty good. Yeah. I tell you what, the times I've done, I grew up literally right underneath the mountain, and all my time spent on the mountain was always good, cold, warm, wet, windy. You just get through it, and then you always know that you're heading home a couple of days later. So you just sort it out then.
That's where that myth comes from. That used to be a goblin in your childhood, right?
What? Goblin. Anyway, TJB asks a Discord question from us for Command and Cookout. If you do want to get your Command and Cookout questions in, you can get them in via email, askandpassfab@gmail.com. Drop them in the YouTube comments below. Get on our Discord, community Discord through Patreon, where this question has come from, or just any other way you want. Drop them to us at Lille if you really want to. Has there ever been an in-depth discussion of how to decide to go first or second? Some local competitive players are very split on whether Viscerai and Fire want to go first in that matchup, as an example, both on aggro plan. For example, pros for going first as Fire is that there's a 25% chance to get a Phoenix Flame or Flame Call Awakening, or may have a 16 or 17 damage turn that leaks through some damage. Going second is good for obvious reasons of getting the first real stakes turn. So, TJB is talking about the tempo aspect of having the first attack of the game if all things are blocked down turn 0. Pros to Viscerai going first is that he may be able to get in some arcane damage, though with the little builds unlikely to be much. Is there consensus? How do you ultimately decide? Is there a life total difference that feels worth it? Like if you know you can leak 4 damage in Arsenal turn 0, or is that better than going second? So, Brendan, I wanted to pick this question because I think this is a very big question, first of all, but one that has come up multiple times, and I thought we could just tackle and just talk about, because there is, I like to say that there is a bit of a science to going first or second for sure, but there's also a bit of an art to going first or second in terms of it's not always, I think, black and white in terms of there's a lot of variables and a lot of things that change. And sometimes it can be really close, and it can really be about what you think your opponent wants to do and the feel of the game. So I wanted to talk through a few different, I guess, considerations, things you think about or work out if you're choosing whether to go first or second. And I think, Brendan, you're going to love this one. The first one is really, it's all about preparation, right? Like, you want to know before you head into a match if you want to go first or second, yeah?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, it's very predictable, right? If you look at your matchup spread. I mean, most of the examples mentioned by T here were based off constructed. I think in limited, it's actually a bit more straightforward than constructed. But constructed, obviously, you can go based off your game plans, but Yeah, so I think for going first or going second, I find myself in limited, usually going second and finding the choice to be a bit easier. I will change that choice based off if my opponent is on a hero that, it really behooves them to go first, whether it's via dominate, any kind of uninteractable damage, something like that. But in constructed, it gets a bit more complicated because I think the power level of hands can change quite drastically from something like a 4-card hand to a 5-card hand. You could also be playing heroes that are looking for very specific cards, things like Briar looking for Chain of Mount Heroic, or even Old Briar looking for Plunder Run. You mentioned Viscerai being able to leak arcane damage. Well, Viscerai also can build up rune chance, maybe less so than he used to, but still, it is some incremental advantage. We used to do the same thing in Chain, right? You would play Chain, you would choose to go first, and a lot of times you would Shackle pass. Now, that is dependent on the 5-card hand, but it is also just the incremental advantage of having one Shackle up. And, if you're in a Chain mirror and you're a Shackle ahead of your opponent, it can be quite an advantage. So, constructed, it's a little bit more complicated, but at the same time, you can... it's a part of developing game plans. It's part of developing sideboard plans and understanding your matchups. You sort of predetermine whether you plan to go first or second.
Yeah, I think to answer, I guess, the question in its entirety, kind of the crux of the question, there is no consensus, and there shouldn't be, because, like Brendan just said, it really depends. So I think a big part of it, like we said, is preparation, and it is. So you take class constructed as an example. It's part of your game plans, even to the point that you're probably, boarding differently, setting your deck up in a different way based on going first or second. That could be equipment, that could be cards in the deck. And this is something that I, personally, I'm always thinking about when it comes to the sideboard plan. Okay, if I'm going first, this is the approach I want if I'm going second. And there's a few other considerations which I definitely want to get to. But first I want to talk about, I guess, some examples of this, because Brennan, you alluded to some, T talked about some, but I want to just use a few different clear examples. I want to start with limited. So I think you can use the current limited format to look at this and say, is it better to go first or second in any given matchup? And what you need to think about is, let's take a Fire Mirror, for example, right? In a Fire Mirror, what do you gain from going first? Okay, I go first. Maybe I can leak damage because my opponent has a lot of 2 blocks. Maybe they have a Phoenix Flame in the hand, etc. And I can arsenal a card. Now you got to work out what's the value of that card in your arsenal. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? It's really going to depend, right, on how strong your hand is. If you draw a pretty average to weak hand, can you actually leak damage and can you arsenal a good card? That's kind of some of your considerations, right? On the flip side, say I choose to go second. Well, my opponent tries to leak damage. I block out with my whole hand. Maybe I leak 1 or 2 damage, and then I get to come in with the first, attack that takes tempo on turn 1 with both players having a full card hand. So those are kind of like some of the base considerations, right? And I think a lot of the consensus is you obviously want to go second in this current format of limited. If you port that over to class constructed, Brendan, you just said it. That might be the considerations you're looking at in limited. There's so many more that come into it going second. I think there's a few kind of I guess like rules of thumb you can come back to and things you can think about. I guess concepts you can think about, but use an example. You talked about Chain, right? Well, in most matchups, what's the value of getting a Soul Shackle and getting a card in Arsenal and maybe a Rune Chant on the board versus having, I guess, the tempo? In Chain, that Soul Shackle was like so important because it represented a card and that kept going. You get to your third Soul Shackle, half a turn earlier, etc. So going first is generally really, really strong, right? But maybe in a more traditional aggro matchup, where the value of that Arsenal card is not that high, but the tempo and the damage for going second is higher, then maybe you want to go second. So Warrior Mirrors, for instance, could be an example of that. So there's a lot of different things to think about.
Yeah.
How do you... I actually want to say one thing on that as well, is what's really important is to think about what your opponent wants to do. So you can think about all the things you want to do with your deck, like this is what my deck can do, but that's only half the equation. Your opponent's sat on the other side. Do they want to go first or do they want to go second? So what are they trying to do? Limited, I think, again, this is a lot easier. Like you said, you just talked about the Fire Mirror. Well, you've just done both sides of the equation. Switch it to Dromai on the other side. Do their side of the equation. What do they want to do with their first turn going second or first? And you can work backwards that way. And you can do the same in Constructed. It's just a little bit more complicated because you probably need to know a little bit more about what your opponent's trying to do and what's in their deck, yeah?
Mm-hmm. I find that going second is somewhat equivalent to card advantage to an extent, because if you just assume that the first turn 0 of the game is sometimes not really a turn, right? The damage is blocked out. Let's assume there's no leak damage, right? I can be up like 3 cards on my opponent. I draw the cards back up. I block the 3 cards, but these cards come back to my hand, and now those cards are actually presenting real threats to my opponent when it comes back to my turn, which is going second. I also think that it can get really interesting, and this is, I think me and Michael Hamilton had a really long discussion about this back in Vegas, which is, if you look at going second as card advantage, it seems like it's going to be correct most of the time, right? And outside of the other obvious reasons of why you might want to go first, it's like your opponent has dominate, maybe your opponent's a wizard or something like that. There's a question of this, like let's say on turn 0, it's very likely that I'll hit you for 5 damage past the threshold of your entire hand, right? Leak 5 damage, whether that's hitting 2 times for 4, and then, there's like some arcane damage that comes in for 3 at the end, and you can't block it. And you attack me for 15, but then I also attack you for 15, right? I am presenting lethal on the second turn of the game, so it's like you're already having to block with cards out of your hand based off on my sort of second turn, right? And I'm presenting lethal. So like the first player to present lethal is me, and the first player to be ripping cards out of the opponent's hand is me. And this is in like an aggro v aggro. It's like, would it be correct to go first in that scenario, right? Because it's like the damage threshold that can be presented on each turn, whether it's a limited set or 2 specific constructed decks, might behoove you to actually choose to go first because it's so high. The most extreme case of this is actually Viscerai in Blitz back when it was busted, where you would choose to go first because you could literally kill your opponent on the first turn of the game.
Yeah, it's what you can do. So you talked about like breakpoints and stuff. You can use some examples of this. Rhinar and Blitz is another example, right? Going first is often quite optimal because you can leak damage. You have ways to disrupt the opponent, intimidate their hand, and leak damage. Plus, also if you can do that, then on your second turn, you can probably take the full swing depending on the matchup. Just take if you're playing a deck they can't do you 20 damage. You get to come back with a 5-card hand, and maybe you've leaked a little bit of damage. You can probably present lethal, like you say, take cards in hand or just kill them. So there is definitely like that kind of aspect to it. And it translates over to constructed in the same way it translates over to limited. It's just a little bit less clear, I think, than maybe a format like Blitz. But then there is also, the kind of, you can literally just like apply some sort of simple equation to it. And this is why I think the default often will be to go second, because let's say we start on our turn and we can't leak damage, but we can arsenal a card. The value of that arsenal card is, say, maybe 4 or 5 damage. Maybe it's a lightning surge from arsenal or something, so it's going to be with 4 damage, or maybe it's worth something that's slightly more that works with other cards and can be with 5 damage. And we can set up say something on the board. Maybe it's a quicken token max, or it's an embodiment of lightning. Let's go with that. Let's go with a Briar example. You can embodiment lightning and you get a lightning surge in your arsenal. Now, if the average hand is worth 12 damage, right? We've got up to 16 plus, maybe a little bit more. If our opponent comes in with an average hand comes in for 12, where are we at on that kind of just equation of trading damage? Have we made up enough? Because like you said before, you could take 3 cards from someone, Brendan, if you come with an attack if blocking is the correct option. So where are you at on the equation? Like, is your arsenal slot plus your embodiment of lightning on the board enough to make up for the fact that your opponent gets to have the first attack of the game and then draw back up afterwards, and now you're either down on cards or you're down on damage? So if you want to keep that full 5-card hand plus your embodiment of lightning, are you taking 12 damage? Are you now at 28, and now you're coming in with your 5-card hand versus your opponent's 4-card hand, and that's where the game really starts. So I think if you want to understand, should I be going first, for instance, I think the question I always want to ask is, do I want to go first, not do I want to go second? It's actually just, do I want to go first? Can I make reasons for this? Then those are the things I'm looking at. I'm trying to understand what that arsenal's worth, what the things on board are worth, what anything that I can potentially do on turn 1 is worth. I think that's kind of the best place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of calling back to what I was talking about, I feel like in constructed, it's a lot of times why you do choose to go first is because just sort of the ridiculous, almost exponential increase of your potential damage based off the 5-card hand, and then also how fast you can kill your opponent on the Turk cycle. So it's like they can crack back at you at a 4-card hand. Doesn't matter if you play 2 5-card hands into them; they're dead anyway. You see this a lot, not a lot, but you see this potentially in some of the Runeblade decks, right? So when they are able to put the Channel Mount Heroic in Arsenal, or maybe land the Channel Mount Heroic early, get the embodiment of lightning as well, just really set up for an explosive turn, and then after that explosive turn, on their turn 2, turn 3, they're already ripping cards. So yeah, it's a really interesting concept. I think that fundamentally it's usually correct to go second, but this combinations of cards and constructed decks are liable to sort of break that rule, and also evasion as well, right? Getting damage in because your opponent cannot block, whether it's dominate or it's intimidate or it's arcane damage.
What do you think is safer when you win the die roll, going first or second?
Second.
Just in general.
Yeah, second.
Of all the die rolls you've won in Flesh and Blood, have you chosen to go first or second more?
So I chose to go second more. I chose to go first more because I think that I didn't understand that concept quite as well, but also I played a lot more constructed, right? And I felt in constructed, a lot of the decks that we've been playing recently have been the hyper aggressive decks, right? So the Chains and the Briars, and I feel like those decks do want to go first. And we're talking about Chain, we had Soul Shackles with Briar, who had Plunder Run, and Wizard. That was a combo deck we wanted to set up, and we could also have damage that had evasion. So back when we played Ninja Turtle, I chose to go second. But if we look back to a format like Welcome to Wraith, I would choose to go second unless I was playing against Bravo.
Yeah, it's just an interesting question because I think, like us learning a lot about this kind of concept of first versus second, like I'm probably in the same boat, and I think a lot of people are because, especially in Classic Constructed, like you said, going first feels safer. It feels like, well, there's not really too much that can go wrong. Whereas if I go second, maybe they leak damage somehow that I don't know about, or they set up something that I don't know about, and then they have this crazy 5-card hand on on turn 2. There's all these things that come into it, but realistically, that's all kind of irrelevant, especially if you've done the preparation, which we just talked about at the start. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I've chosen to go first a lot more, and incorrectly in a lot of situations as well. And it's something that's been kind of a big learning for me is that, I'm not saying that second is always going to be correct or it should be necessarily the default, but I think people choose to go first more than they should because it's just a gap in understanding, I think. So this kind of idea of being prepared, I think it should come into people's testing, to be honest. So when you're talking about limited or constructed, I think first, second should be part of your testing. You can do that. You can add it into your testing. It's not that hard. You can start from a theory standpoint of what do we think is better or what do we think could happen if X of the matchup goes first and goes second. And then just play a few games and then think about it with the start and draw. Did that play out the way you thought it did? Did it not play out the way you thought it did? So does something unexpected happen that changes your mind about going first versus second? And that's testing first versus second in a matchup. So yeah, the only last thing I want to talk about is, like this kind of idea of sideboarding and equipment setup. That can change. Format, Blitz, Limited, Classic Constructed. The way you set up being first or second, it should be relevant. And it's definitely something that I think people should think about. But my challenge would be challenge this idea that you just default go first when you don't know, and maybe it's default you go second when you don't know. Is that the better place to be?
Yeah, I think it is the better place to be honest, on like a fundamental basis. It's just like in constructed, I think that the sort of power of Flesh and Blood, it's weird to say the word power, but at least the damage numbers have been going up, right? Like we see explosive turns are much more common, and the amount of damage you can hit by on a single turn does seem to have been increasing, right? Like it does kind of fluctuate a bit, but like if you look back at like something like Welcome to Wraith or Arcane Res or even Crucible of War, like the amount of damage you were going to get hit by on like a 5-card hand was not your entire life total sometimes. So it wasn't hitting those 30 thresholds. So like nowadays, 5 is obviously kind of toned down a bit, but even with the Rune Blades, you can see some just ridiculous stuff come your way.
Yeah, I mean, like there's some decks in the past that just couldn't use their 4-card hand. You know what I mean? And so like putting them going second actually was fine because you could get, say, 4 damage value in your arsenal, maybe even 5 with a setup card. You get something on the table, maybe it's a couple of rune chants or whatever, and then on their turn they're like, cool, I come in for 7 with this attack. And you're like, cool. So like this is, I'm trading pretty equitable damage here, except that I now have this 5-card hand which can be exponentially explosive. So, and it's the same in limited. I think you look back at this limited format has really good ways to utilize your full hand. Previous limited formats, Welcome to Wraith, there's Let's Go Again, even something like Monarch, right? With a deck like Levia, often it's like, I want to block with 2 cards, attack with 2 cards. Mm-hmm. And if you put up the opponent going second, it makes it really difficult for them to do that. So, there is nuances, I think, and it's going to be format dependent, it's going to be deck dependent, and again, you can just kind of be prepared for this and be across it. So, great question there from TJB. If you do want to get any questions in, like I say, to the Commander Cookout, you can do it any which way you want. Email, again, it's arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. You can drop in the YouTube comments below or DM us. Anyway, Brendan, I think it's time to talk a bit more about sort of fundamentals and concepts in Flesh and Blood and move on to the main topic of the show.
Yeah, defending in Flesh and Blood, probably one of the most underrated concepts because it's a bit less sexy than attacking, although some people really do like defending. Some people think it's the sexiest thing you can do in the game. But I think this is one of the biggest level ups you can get as a new player, right? Because I remember when Flesh and Blood first came out, so like back in 2019, 2020, a lot of newer players that came from other games would always ask me like a kind of like a single fundamental question, which is like, why would I ever block? And I think that's a good way to actually open this main topic, Hayden, and I'll pose that question to you, which is, why would you ever block in Flesh and Blood? Why not just attack?
I mean, there's so many reasons. I mean, the obvious reason is to get the most value out of my hand. That's the most obvious reason for why you should defend, is to get the most value possible out of your hand. So, like we said before, a hand might not be able to use all 4 cards offensively, like we just talked about with the Commander Cookout question. They might only be able to use 2 efficiently. So, if I have an attack for 7 and I have 2 cards that block for 6, well, I can get 13 damage out of that net. Like that's the very base reason for why you should defend in this game.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting. It's like there's been this kind of like I wrote some notes to this before and I was thinking about it. Like there's been this kind of I think ebb and flow in Flesh and Blood where we've moved more and more actually now towards this idea of like the offensive turns are the strength of the game. Like people are so, whenever we talk about the game, whenever we talk about class constructed decks, even when we talk about limited decks, a lot of the focus that us, any players out there, a lot of the focus comes on what does the offensive look like? What 5-card hands have become the the buzzword of the buzz term of Flesh and Blood. What do these 5-card hands look like? How much damage can you push? But really, and I guess it's something that gets forgotten is that defense is still part of the game. And of course we do. I'm not just talking about ultra defensive decks, right? I'm not just talking about, like you said before, the love of the defense. I'm not talking about Ultim. I'm not talking about fatigue. I'm talking about just generally, first of all, like I just said, getting the most out of your hand, but just defending for efficiency and defending to gain advantage in games, because there's so many ways, and I think defending is getting harder, to be honest. I think that's a big part of it as well, and I think it's something that for some reason is being missed and we should talk more about, because combat chains are going wider. You look at things like Fire, Briar, damage is getting more mixed, a lot more arcane and split damage, arcane damage, and physical damage with rune blades, of course, and even to the point where we see things like like Dromai, there's or Prism, there's different damage types coming at you with permanence on the board in the form of Dromai. So I think the defensive portion of the game is becoming harder, but we seem to only focus on the offensive game at the moment.
It's a funny thing that's happened. I don't know if it's quite a bell curve, but definitely when the game started, nobody really blocked. Like there's very few blocking, and then the blocking came in. People realized and this is back when we had just a few sets, but it was quite easy to evaluate the value of your hand on offense versus defense. But now it's gotten a bit different because of the way the cards are sort of dependent on each other, and just how exponential the power can be, right? Things like Plunder Run, right? And multiple hit triggers, getting multiple embodiments back in those days. Nevertheless, I think we went through a phase of like a lot of blocking, right? Fatigue became a thing. There were a lot of control decks. And then we sort of come back into this phase where blocking is actually starting to be seen to an extent. It's not quite there, but it's becoming, I've heard it mentioned as sort of that in the same mythical realm as the second cycle of the deck. Like some people don't think that blocking exists. They said, why would you ever block? Because like now you see decks like Fi, especially Combo Fi. You see the Rune Blades sometimes. They've been powered down a bit. But back in the day, it's like, well, I just always do more damage with my hand. It always does more damage. And there's been like this sort of, no block to no block again. But now with the bans and some heroes rotating out, I think we're coming back close to a portion where you do want to be sort of taking a closer look at your hand and figuring out if you do want to defend or attack.
Yeah, it's not just class construct as well, though. It's limited. Yeah, like I think that's something I noticed at my limited road to nationals is that people were just like misblocking and losing points of health, basically. Like it got to the point where the end of the chain where they're like, oh, I'm going to defend with this card at some point, but I want to hold it for a non-hit effect. And all of a sudden, the Phoenix Flame is coming in, and then they're like, I guess I block with this card, or I don't block with them. They have a dead card in their hand. Like those sorts of things are starting to creep back into the game, which I think is kind of crazy, right? Because that's just, you just lost 2 points of damage there, or 3 points of damage potentially, which is kind of nuts, right? But it is something I'm seeing a bit more of again. So, and it's not, like I said before, it's not easy. Like the defending of this game is becoming harder because, let's say for example, you think that, okay, defending is like net negative, right? Like I don't want to defend because my hand always deals more damage. I have like all these 2 blocks in my deck. My things say 3 and 4 and plus on them, right? But then you've got on-hit effects coming back into the game, more or in some way, shape, or form, whether it be, something like Mothering Skies out of Viscerai, whether it be, like Crush effects, whether it be this and that. And taller effects are easier to see, right? Because say a Crippling Crush comes in at you or a Spinal Crush, that's the attack. I know what's happening. Let's stay away from Pummel for now, but you can see that right in front of you, right? Whereas if your opponent has 5 cards in hand, they lead with their first card, and it's a 0 for 3. It's a Bramble Cyndaquil. What does the rest of their hand look like? That's really hard to know. So it's really hard to know how you should defend. But your defensive hand, so your hand, sorry, if your kind of just default is like, I want to attack with all these 4 cards, and then your opponent comes in with, they've got Master Momentum and they're playing Fire. If you don't defend, say, that second or third attack, right, what's the value of that card in your hand now? Because you've now just given them the card. It could have been worth 2 on defense or 4 on offense, but actually maybe it could have been worth 5 on defense because they draw another red Bramble Cyndaquil or Rising Resentment or whatever it is. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to defense, I think, outside of just the printed numbers on my card do this and the printed numbers on my opponent's cards do this. So I think the one big takeaway, you just asked why to me before, Brendan, right? But when I think about why you should focus on defense a lot more and these sort of like, I guess, try and get more edge with your defensive sort of side of the game, is that you're going to remember the small mistakes you make on offense, right? Like, oh, I missequenced this, or I didn't quite do this the right way, or my Snapdragon scalers, right, Brendan? But are you going to remember the times where you leaked 1 or 2 damage from misblocking? Oh, I didn't block the 3 attack. Now my opponent's coming with a 2 attack, but I committed to blocking with this card in my hand because it does nothing. I've missed a point of damage that way, or small things like that. Those are things you're not really going to remember, to be honest. I don't think people focus on as much, but it all adds up. Like 1 to 2 damage across 4 or 5 turns in a game is 10 damage. Like it's 5 to 10 damage. That's a lot of life total, and these games could end at 1 or 2. And you might not take a look back. You might take a look back at a specific turn and be like, oh, I leaked I didn't save a point of damage here or 2 points of damage here. But I lost by like 5 or 6 life. But actually, if you looked at multiple turns in a row, could there have been a lot of damage that got missed over that game just by some inefficiencies in defense? And you might not always see them straight up, I think, is something that I've kind of learned.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. And this is, I see this play out a lot with Quell as well, like misusing Quell in the current format, the coin limited format. I think Michael Fang was on the podcast recently, and I definitely am congruent with what he said, where it's like getting up 1 damage, 1 point of health or 1 point of damage on your opponent via Quell, or quelling in a better situation than your opponent, wins so many games. I think that Uprising is seen as such an aggressive format and such an attacking format. Like that, it feels like that's where the games are won. At the surface level, but I think the more you dig into it, the more you see that they're often won actually on the defensive level, and it's just a hyper efficient format. And if you're able to efficiently use a piece of armor with Quell on it when your opponent does not get that, I find you can win the game. You'll win a lot of games that way.
Yeah, and I think it translates into class constructed, like the I guess the skill, like the either ends of the sort of like skill gap, I guess, are closing significantly, and the game's getting tighter. There's more explosive decks out there. That 1 or 2 points of damage can matter a lot more, and I think it translates across all the formats. So I think we've, especially me, have waxed lyrical enough about kind of the reasons why we should focus on the sort of defensive elements of the game. But why don't we talk about, I guess, some of these considerations on a defensive turn, like how do you approach this? What are the things you should like focus on and think about on the defensive side of the game to notice these things, to improve on them, to get better on them? So I want to start with the first one because it's pretty simple, but I think it does get forgotten often because sometimes the default is, well, I'm just going to attack with my whole hand. But Brendan, it's just doing the math. Yep. It's just, what is the net damage that's available on the table here, taking all things into consideration. So I used that Mask Momentum example before, but if I attack with all my cards, if I defend with all my cards, and then some iteration in between, what is the most damage that I can effectively add up to, both on defense and offense, with those 4 cards?
Yeah,
5 cards.
Absolutely. I think that's super important. It's kind of on that same vein, not quite, but like just because you gave a constructed example, I just want to give a limited example, which we already kind of talked about. But if you're playing something like Fi, right, and you have 8 blues in your deck, or maybe 9 blues, which is close to optimal, there's a turn where you draw 2 blues, right? And these are normal blues in the Uprising format, and they block for 2. You utilize that turn to pitch one of your blues for Quell, and you turn that blue into a block 3. It seems small, but it is massive, right? Because the likelihood that there will be 3 attacks in that combat chain where you're facing an opposing Fi, and they have a 4-card hand or a 5-card hand, extremely likely, right? So you now have the option to cash in a 2-block blue for a 3-block total, and it was going to be redundant in your hand anyway. I think that those are kind of like, those are some of the play lines where you doing the math, it's like you're getting above rate, and like that's what you want to be doing.
Yeah. There's something I want to come back to on that, but I don't want to jump the gun because I don't want to I don't want to muddle and confuse, I guess, this kind of what I think is important in the defensive turn, and something that's a concept that I do want to talk about, but it relates basically to the concept you just talked about, which is, when you might want to use a card defensively. But I want to come back to that, Brendan. I want to talk about the use of equipment, because you literally just started talking about it with Quell there. This is how you can gain a lot of edge. So the classic example, right? I know you love this one, Brendan, is
Yep.
Arcanite Skullcap. What do you say about Arcanite Skullcap, Brendan? Tell us your wisdom on Arcanite Skullcap.
Well, let's back it up a bit. Let's talk about how equipment gets used incorrectly. And it's going to sound really funny, and you're going to be like, I would never do that. But I've seen so many high-level professional players in calling finals, in national finals, do this silly thing. This is that one silly tip that you need to stop doing to win a world championship. Don't block with your armor for no reason. It makes no freaking sense. Not all damage is created equal, and most decks have on-hit triggers. And if you're cognizant that your opponent does have on-hit triggers, like they have Snatch, if you're blocking raw damage with your armor that is going to kill you or put you at a critical threshold where you will die and you won't be able to interact, that is incorrect. And it's often even incorrect with Arcanite Skullcap. So for Arcanite Skullcap, it is important, if you can, to get the value of 3 block out of it. But I don't think at the cost of potentially losing the ability to block with it when a relevant on-hit trigger comes. So, like, let's say Arcanite Skullcap is your only block available. You know your opponent has Snatches in their deck, but you're still like, I just want to cheek out this one block, and I think I'm going to be lower later. Okay, let me block with it, and boom, they hit you with the Snatch, and I have to block with 2 cards. Or let's say you have your 5-card hand, you have Channel Mouth Heroic, right? You're like, I'm about to just put it on my opponent. I will never be at a lower life total. Yeah, it might be actually correct to early block with Arcanite Skullcap and get some value out of it while you can. Maybe not on hit trigger, and just do it for raw damage, because you know that you're going to be the beatdown on the following turns. And so that's a little bit of a ramble. Those are my opinions on Arcanite Skullcap, and also about this phenomenon where people just randomly block with their freaking armor, which is actually happening a lot less. I remember walking around Pro Tour number 1 at the high tables and seeing armor that wasn't blocked with early in the game, because that is just one of the craziest things I think you can do. Like, you have this ability, like this permanent card on the table that you can utilize to stop on-hit triggers that will drastically increase your opponent's damage and their ability to maybe even reduce your damage. It's so important to be cognizant of when and where to block with that armor.
Oh, I know you're passionate about it, so I had to hand it to you on that one and segue you in perfectly and let you go. The thing you said about all damage isn't equal, not all damage is equal, is so true, and that's why equipment is so important, and that's where you get the advantage with your equipment. It's, yes, my equipment, the printed value is 2, it's 1, it's 2, whatever, it's temper, it's blade break, but actually, you can often make that equipment worth more than that. Like you said before, if I have no equipment, I have to block with 2 cards on a Snatch, and all my opponent's getting, significantly more value than just the 1 damage that's leaking through if I just block with a 3 block, yeah? But if I block with my piece of equipment, say my 8th Ironweave and a card from hand, or my Tunic and a card from hand, or my, Iron Rot Boots, whatever it is, plus my card in hand, I've gotten, effectively 1 plus the on-hit effect of value out of that defensive piece of equipment, and that's massive. That's huge. So I did want to kind of piggyback on what you just said and kind of point that out, because that's the importance of equipment. That's what finding the right spot to block with your equipment is going to make your equipment worth more than the damage printed on it. And this kind of idea of like, get the value out of Skullcap, I'm not going to be lower than my opponent for the rest of the game. Aren't you just winning those games probably then? Like, the only situation where it becomes relevant is then you go to like, you become 1-1 on life and you can't use the Skullcap. But if you're using your Skullcap at 1 just for pure damage, just for, not an on-hit effect, just to stop pure damage, and then you think you're never going to be below your opponent, it's probably not relevant. Do you know what I mean? It's probably not relevant.
So the only times that I really see that play out and where it's relevant is like if it's a Briarmere, right? And you're like, okay, I have Channel Mount Heroic, I'm about to put it on my opponent, right? But somehow they survive, right? And your Channel Mount Heroic goes away, and now they come back with their own, and maybe they become the beatdown. I think this like transitioning of roles is actually with those kind of decks, it's a little bit more rare. Usually you keep the tempo, you keep the momentum, you stay the beat down throughout the game. But like sometimes those room blade matchups, it can come down to like trying to sneak out of value. But I find people that liberally block with their their Arcanite Skullcap for raw damage probably lose more games than people that don't.
Especially when it's on 0 counters, when it's that first block with it. I think that's often
it's crazy.
Yeah, so equipment use, very important. Brendan gave a great example of Quell. We talked about sort of physical equipment use. I mean, there's other things as well, but basically the kind of like long and short of it is like, what is the value of your equipment? So if you're pitching a blue 3 block to Quell, you're not gaining any value on that, right? Like you said before, you used the Michael Finn example. If you're using your piece of Iron Rod boots just to block vanilla damage, you're not gaining advantage on that. And you shouldn't be doing that really unless you need to because you're about to die. Or something we haven't talked about, you go to a threshold where it's going to be... So, you're playing against a Rosetta Thorn deck. You're on 2 life. You need to use your piece of equipment on vanilla damage to not go to 1 so that you just immediately die to the Rosetta Thorn, for instance, right? Maybe you've also got Nullrune. So there's all these sorts of things. But try and get the most out of your equipment in terms of the value, and try and make the printed value on your equipment, get more than the printed value on the equipment, rather. That's what your aim should be when thinking about your equipment from the defensive side. So I want to talk about next thing, Brendan, is this idea of opposition turn mapping, which is something we talked a little bit about actually in the Commander Cookout question. It's not just about why I want to go first or second, it's why does my opponent want to go first or second? What does the matchup look like? And this is kind of the same thing with this idea when we think about the defensive side of the game and opposition turn mapping, which is literally what is likely to happen for the rest of the turn. So we're sat there, 5 cards versus 5 cards, right? I've got 4 in hand, I've got a card in arsenal. Brendan, you've got 4 cards and a card in arsenal. And you play out your first card. It's a red Bramble Cinderclaw. Now, the first thing that I should be doing before I even decide what I want to defend with, if I do want to defend with anything, is work out what I think is likely to happen for the rest of your turn. That's really important because that's going to allow us to decide how and where we should defend, if we should defend, and what it looks like. So, you play out your red Bramble Cinderclaw. You have 3 cards left in hand, the card in arsenal. I'm reasonably going to assume that, you have a blue, you can come in with your Emberblade, you've probably got 2 more attacks plus that in your hand to come in with, and then a Phoenix Flame's going to come in, and maybe you have something like a Love Burst at the end, right? That's just baseline what I'm thinking. Okay, you have a Mask of Momentum in play. I'm probably going to need to block with at least 2 things. I'm going to have to block on 2 attacks here to stop this, and then we start to go to work on that. This idea of opposition turn mapping can be quite daunting, I think, because it can take time to think through this. So if we just talk through that line, we could have sat here for 2 or 3 minutes and talked through Brendan's potential lines. And then all of a sudden Brendan does something else and completely throws this idea we had out the window. He goes, actually, you know what? I don't have blue. I've just got all attacks, or actually I've got 2 blues and I'm actually attacking with this red flying kick. I don't know. It could be something completely different to what we think, right? So, but what this allows us to at least do is just kind of have this quick kind of thought process of, well, I think Brendan's got at least 4 more attacks here. When do I want to block and how do I want to block? This is vanilla damage. I'm more about on-hit effects that could come later, say like a snatch at the end of the chain. I'm gonna keep cards in hand for that because I know with my hand, I only want to block with max 1 card because as soon as I take a second card out of my hand falls apart. It doesn't function. I could do 15 with 4 cards or 16 with 4 cards, but if I only have the 2 cards in hand plus a card in arsenal, I can only do 8 damage, for instance. So that's kind of how that works, and then I'm gonna start mapping out what my opponent can do. Have you?
Yes.
I think this is something that we all do, Brendan. Like you do, but I think it's a concept that maybe we don't talk much about.
So I think that most people, I hesitate to say everybody, does this, right? You think about what can my opponent potentially...
Some degree.
Yeah, what can my opponent potentially hit me with? So I think when this gets more interesting is when you get to a point in the game where you're like, you potentially know how you win the game, and now you have to start evaluating, how do I lose this game? Or what is the worst case scenario? What actually could come at the end of this combat chain? So you mentioned the Snatch, right? But I can take us back to Uprising Limited, and there's a very popular card that can come at the end of that combat chain. Let's say you're about to win. You have a 5-card hand. You need that 5th card to win the game. And the second to last card is coming in. Maybe it's coming in for 3, and you have 1 more card in hand, 1 resource floating. What is it? It's a breaking point. And it's like, boom, you're dead, right? It's like I lose.
I was thinking Rise Up, but
no, but it can be like breaking point. I can lose my 5th card, and now it's a huge swing, right? So I have this card that blocks for 3. I know I only need a 3-card hand to win or something like that, right? Like a 3-card hand plus my arsenal. And I plan to block with this card, but when am I going to do it, right? When on the chain, when is the most effective? It's a clean block on the blade, but there could be a breaking point later down the chain, right? There could be a breaking point that I need to block, and then maybe, I'll throw some armor in front of it if I had armor that blocked in Uprising. But you know what I'm saying, right? So it's really easy to clean block the blade when you have no information. I think it's always better to block when more information is given rather than less, but sometimes, you don't have a choice, right? Because the last thing you want to do is be going into your turn now, having not blocked with that card with redundant cards in hand that don't really do anything to help your turn. So yeah, it's very dynamic. This is effectively the game of Flesh and Blood, is like, what is my opponent going to do? What could they have? And how do I maximize my turn because of this? But yeah.
Yeah, like my example before, right? What if the last card is in fact just a Phoenix Flame for 1?
Mm-hmm.
and now you're set at this card being like, well, I'm about to lose 2 points of value here because I'm going to block this because my card literally does nothing, or I'm going to lose 3 and keep the card in my hand for no value. It's not, say you already had an Arsenal set up or something. So it's not easy. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, it is the crux of what Flesh and Blood is, but I think we kind of forget this idea when it comes to, I think we think about it from an offensive standpoint a lot. These are the things that I know I can do, and we think about, oh, what does my opponent do offensively here? But then the consequence of that is like, what does that mean for our defense? And I think the more you keep in mind these cards like Breaking Point, I can think in Welcome to Wraith Limited, like open the center, right? How many times did I die to an open the center? Because it's like, well, oh wow, now I'm on 3 and I should have just blocked this card earlier because I planned to block 2 cards in this turn anyway. Like understanding what you probably want to defend with, how you want to defend in a turn, and at what points on the chain you should defend with is like really important. And it's a lot easier when they come in with a tall attack. Okay, I pitch a blue or 2 blues and I come in with this Spinal Crush, right? Like pitch 2 blues, come with Spinal Crush. That's a lot easier to see what's happening. It's a lot easier to evaluate this. It's way harder when your opponent pitches a blue, comes in with their Kodachi for 1, and they still have 4 cards in hand, or 3 cards in hand. Like what is the next thing they're going to do? That is a lot harder to evaluate. So, and I think that's why those decks in general feel harder to defend. And people just go default, I'll just block the 3rd attack and stop the mask momentum or whatever it is. So this kind of idea of like opposition like turn mapping at least gives you somewhat of an idea, and you don't have to like know it down to the card. And once they play their first card or the second card, you don't then have to stop and go, oh, I have to reevaluate everything. At least just having in mind, first of all, like an idea of what you think they're going to do across the turn, and then what that means for your hand, because you can pretty quickly and clearly go, oh yeah, I just have this redundant card like you just said, Brennan, that like this card is going to be used to defend either way. Let's find the best possible place on the chain to defend with it. And sometimes that's earlier because you don't want to lose value on it. And sometimes it's later because you're more worried about the on-hit effect. And that's going to change as the game goes through. The value of the on-hit effect can change at different points of the game. Like that breaking point might mean nothing early in the game. Like, oh, we're not in this kind of weird spot where life total thresholds are important. And if they do attack with that last, I'll just throw 2 cards. Like it's not as important. I can afford to lose a little bit of efficiency. But later in the game, where if you lose efficiency, that's probably enough for your opponent to swing the tempo back and just kill you on the following turn. That's really big. So, yeah, I think it's a concept. I mean, one that comes to mind, right, when it comes to like this idea of like turn mapping and understanding what your opponent wants to do is like, what do you play around? Is like the next thing. So you talked about, do I think my opponent has the breaking point? Yeah. The classic is, CNC. Does my opponent have the pummel for the CNC?
Or just the CNC in general, right? CNC at the end of the combat chain, as you've tried to tank damage. Very common in, I guess less so now, but used to be very common in Runeblade mirrors, right? It's like just that cheeky CNC at the end. And you're like, oh god, because you had a plunder on your arsenal or an Art of War, and like now you're committed to just like basically effectively passing on your next turn. It sucks.
Yeah, it's something that you've got to think about the whole time. And that's the funny thing is, like, the first time it happens, it's like, well, now I'm thinking about CNC out of my Runeblade opponent for the next forever how many games I play because it's something that's happened to me. And that can also like inversely and negatively affect you, right? Where you go, now you just start holding cards, and then your opponent just goes like, oh, I just come in with the blade, and you're like, oh, what? So there is considerations like playing around cards. Often it's just incorrect to play around cards. I think it really depends. So like people try and play around pummel a lot. I think that's often just kind of incorrect.
I think pummel's an outlier though. I think like I agree with you, but I think playing around CNC can be correct, right? Especially when it comes to like how you bucket the armor. But playing around pummel, that is a funny one because the way the pummel works is like you play around pummel, they just arsenal the pummel, and it's coming next time. It's coming next turn. Yeah.
Same with the razor reflex. Like attack reactions are harder to play around, right? Than just kind of defending a bit better so that you can stop on hit effects. And that's where equipment comes in. Like that's the power of equipment, right? It's like the longer you have those pieces of equipment, the harder it is for your opponent to push on hit effects, and the harder it is for actually them to sequence their turn well. Knowing that they can push something or take 2 cards from your hand, because the longer you have the equipment, the longer you can stop your opponent from being able to take multiple cards from your hand, because you always have the threat of your equipment being used. So, important. I want to come back to that thing you talked about earlier, Brendan, where we were talking about, I guess, this idea of the you draw 2 blues in your Fire deck, and you use 1 to quell, right, because it makes up damage. But what I wanted to talk about is just identifying when it's the correct call to actually just give up some tempo. So, tempo is this kind of elusive thing that we talk about, and people say that, if you, in certain formats, if you keep the tempo, you never give it up, you just win the game, right? Like you just always keep on the front foot, effectively. Maybe we can replace that with tempo. You stay on the offensive. You're the one dictating the flow of the game. You're pitching your blue, coming with 3 attacks, pushing damage. Your opponent's sort of forced to defend. sometimes, it feels bad to stop that. So you start playing inefficiencies. You rather than block with one of those 2 blue cards you just had, Brennan, you attack with one of those. You attack with your blue Rising Resentment or your blue Dust Runner Outlaw, whatever it is. And actually, that's kind of, can be negative damage. You've paid 1 resource to come in for 2 damage, which can often be not good. And I wanted to talk about this idea on defense sometimes. Sometimes it's correct to switch gears and defend for a turn. Give your opponent some tempo willingly, because it allows you to actually be more efficient with your hands overall and more efficient with your game plan. Now, this isn't always going to be correct. Sometimes you need to keep the pressure on because life totals are starting to be low, and if you let up, your opponent might be able to swing the game. But especially like early mid-game, I think this is something that people don't do enough, and it actually causes them to miss out on damage. So rather than defend with their blue for 3, I think is a better example, or paying 1 resource to come in for a blue with 2. They'll pay their 1 resource to come in with a blue for 2 offense. And you're just, you're not putting pressure on. It's not something that really hurts your opponent. They can afford to take this. They can find a gap to just take the damage and swing the tempo anyway. So often you're better served just using those cards defensively anyway, stopping something from your opponent, stopping them from, like triggering a Rising Resentment or a yellow mount, mounting anger, whatever it is. Like often you can use your cards a bit smarter, I think, that way. And what you're actually also doing is you're saving yourself some life, which we're going to talk about life threshold soon, but could be really important for where the game shakes out in the end. Sometimes giving up the sort of, or some tempo, if not all the tempo on a specific turn cycle, can be the correct call.
My favorite example of, or sort of gameplay to understanding tempo in Flesh and Blood was actually the Lightning Briar Mirror back around US Nationals, when you could create multiple embodiments. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that deck did revolve around Plunder Run, but it also revolved around a balance of blocking and attacking because of embodiments, right? There was a punishment for not blocking, and your opponent would have enough embodiments to go ahead and block you. So sometimes you would find is your opponent, like you would have multiple embodiments, your opponent would flip their red Plunder Run and maybe play the Art of War at the same time. And you have a bunch of embodiments because you have been the beatdown. Your opponent is not blocking. You are doing damage, right? But you go, okay, I recognize this. This is my opponent's sort of pivot turn, right? They've played they've played the red Plunder Run. They've played their Art of War. This is where they're going to try and flip the game. Well, it happens that I have multiple 3 blocks, which are now 6 blocks in my hand, and a couple 2 blocks, which are now 5 blocks, and I might just block out their entire turn, right? And I felt like that Lightning Briarmere was a real delicate balance between tempo and actually allowed you to have huge edge against your opponent. But yeah, just a little anecdote there.
I don't remember Art of War being in those decks, but
not Art of War, but you know what I get. I mean, just something on top of the Plunder Run where they're overcommitting, or something, whatever it is.
Yeah. The other thing as well that like giving up this tempo sometimes is you play this game where, so when you're on the offense, and this is the underrated side of defense, I think, is when you are the the offender, when you're the offensive player coming in turn after turn, you can brick, which we just talked about, right? And sometimes that's the time where you want to use your hand defensively. But the other thing as well is you actually improve the efficiency of your opponent's hand. A good, like the best players in the world, the good players will be able to understand how to efficiently use their 4 or 5 card hand for the best on offense and defense. And when you, weirdly as it sounds, but when you are coming in and you're the offensive player, a lot of the time you're giving your opponent the best options, the options to defend the way they want to and attack the way they want to. And although that's like, it's not always a negative because you're leaking damage, you're pushing, you can always just be going over the top potentially. But in some instances, like that can kind of add up. Your opponent gets some efficiencies on defense. Actually, they have ways they can start to turn the game. Okay, I'm going to block with 3 cards here, and then I'm going to come in with Snatch while I have an empty arsenal. Your opponent can do that. Whereas if they have, maybe you take a turn off, you break the tempo, you give them some back because you've had a bad hand, you're going to block with it rather than just trying to still brute force it through. Your opponent looks at the hand and goes, I actually can't use this 4-card hand in the way I want to. I can still get, say 9 damage out of this offensively, but defensively I could have got 12 damage out of this hand by attacking with 2 cards and defending with 2 cards. And so there's this idea, I think, that like always being the offense, always being the aggressor actually has its downsides. I think it's important that we kind of remember that. Like the defensive side can have real big benefits, and when it comes to the like use of your hand. So sometimes, like I say, breaking that tempo and giving it to your opponent for the efficiency of your hand can actually also hurt your opponent, which I think is something to remember.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
What about this one, Brendan? Life thresholds, don't have to spend much time on it, but I think it's really important that, if you want to get better at the defensive side of the game, understanding what life thresholds are, what life thresholds are important So, good example used before is like Rosetta Thorn, right? What is that important? But even to the point, Kano and Blitz. What's your life threshold with Kano and Blitz? How much should I be defending to stay above that? Because sometimes defending, say it's you're playing against the old style Kano with Stir Forked, right? You want to be above 13, right?
Above 11
So, right,
at
so you had
AB3.
AB3, you want to be above 11, so you want to be on 12. So going from 13 to 12, not as much of a big deal, right? But going from 12 to 11,
You're
massive
dead.
deal. So
You're dead.
could be dead. So, in the case of going from 13 to 12, yeah, it might not be worth giving up a card for. But going from 12 to 11, yeah, it's worth giving up a card for because you probably just die if you don't, right? Like that's a really like simplified example, but that's literally what the understanding of life thresholds can mean is that, literally a Bravo. Bravo's a great example of this current meta. You have no equipment left. You go to a life threshold where your opponent can dominate and attack and kill you. That's super, super relevant. Like life thresholds are really important, and they can be important like at that point in the game when you're sort of really low on life and it's about the game sort of ending. But they can also equally be as important at like high life totals. So turning off your opponent's Arcanite Skullcap, turning off your opponent's Scar for a Scar. Like these life thresholds can also be really important. Or you get your opponent to below 20, and this means that now you can set up your quad intimidate Reinhardt turn or vice versa. Like these life thresholds aren't just about the sort of the last 2 or 3 points of damage. They can be different things for different matchups. And I think it's important to understand, firstly, what life thresholds you want to get your opponent to be at your best. This can even be important and limited, right? I think in the Fire Mirror, like around that 7-point life total can be really important to get to first because it means that you can present lethal probably through 2 blocks on the way back. And then also what your opponent's trying to do. What life total do they want to get you at?
Mm-hmm. Turning off your opponent's skull cap. Okay, another anecdote. I guess I'm anecdote this this podcast, and a little lesson of Fab history. So Tarek Patel, U.S. Nationals, won every single game in his top 8 by going to 1 and killing his opponent by turning off their skull cap. Makes the arcane damage unblockable if they don't have arcane barrier. It was a very popular strategy for winning those mirrors back in the day. But he won. I don't think he only played Briar. He played Chain as well. He played Michael Thang in the finals. Every single game he won that way. You can go back and watch it. So yeah, I mean, there's like turning off Skullcap. I feel like that's like a slightly atypical way of understanding this concept, which is like I will go low enough that my opponent cannot do anything now against arcane damage. Now I can present them 3 arcane damage, right? A Rune Chant and my Rosetta Thorn, and they can't do anything about it. They're just dead. It's one of my favorites. Kind of one of my favorite concepts around this topic is Tarek Patel using that in all 3 games, all 3 games to ultimately take that trophy.
A lot of us use it that weekend. I know you had a couple of wins. I think I had 1 or 2 wins that way as well over the weekend in the mirror. Like it was really, really relevant. I was surprised that it didn't come up more. Life threshold is really important. I want to give a bit of a balance to what we've just talked about. We've talked a lot about defensive efficiencies and focusing more on the defensive side of the game, but you've got to think about how your game plan is affected as well. So at the end of the day, if you're only focusing on what your opponent's doing and trying to get defensive efficiencies, you might just lose the game because you end up playing the game that they want to play. So I talked about before, sometimes breaking tempo is great and, you can get the benefits out of it. But if, you're always thinking about, okay, what's my best efficient hand here, and you're just defending efficiently and attacking efficiently, you might just lose the game. At some point, you probably need to swing your tempo with your 5-card hand. When is it right to maybe take a bit more damage than even you could deal because of where you're at in the game? So you need to also play your game. I think if you're focusing defensively, often it can be about what's your opponent trying to do. I think you see this with like fatigue decks, right? And controlling decks.
Yep. Most efficient way would like if you looked at your 4 cards, like how efficiently can I play this out? Play my 4-card hand, play my 4-card hand, and next thing you know, you've done 0 damage, right? Because a lot of times you're going to need a 5-card hand to leak damage against something like Oldhim because of Crown of Seeds and their ability, their armor and just their inherently defensive ability in the cards that they play in that deck. So yeah, I mean, if we looked at it just raw efficiency would say, just play out the 4-card hand every turn, but that's absolutely not correct if you want to try to win that match. There's also deck stacking, right? Pitching relevant cards back to the bottom of the deck, maybe in a specific order so that you can overcome something like fatigue.
Or even on the fatigue side of it, right, as well. So say I'm the Oldhim player. If I'm just continually using my 4 or 5 cards to defend my opponent every single turn, there's no pressure on them. They can take infinite time to set up what they want. So how can I start to introduce, say, my Frosthammer, my Winter's Wail into the game to put pressure on them? And so, sometimes it's going to be worth taking a damage or 2 damage to come in with the Winter's Wail on the way back, which presents a threat, presents an on-hit effect, starts to pressure them. So, you can't just continue to play your opponent's game the whole time. You do have to play your own game, and I do think that's a balance to the defensive side.
Yeah.
Last one, Brendan. my favorite one here is just learning when to just lick the stamp and send it. Sometimes you have to accept that you can't play around things, that you can't defend in the way that you maybe want to. And sometimes you just have to hope that your opponent's hand isn't as good as you think it might be. You need to let go of some efficiencies to swing some tempo, take some damage, and just do it. Just attack. Just try and win the game. You can't just defend out for the entire game.
Like the stamp and send today. It's a phrase I haven't heard. I mean, probably no size to you. One of my biggest hobbies as a small child was licking stamps.
It actually comes from, I stole this quote from an Australian athlete by the name of Daniel Ricciardo. If anyone's a Formula One, he's a big lick the stamp and send it person. So
sounds like an Australian thing to say. I'm not gonna lie.
It does, doesn't it? Right. All right. Lastly, Brendan, want to go through just a couple of things of how to improve your defensive game. We talked about all these kind of concepts to focus on, but how do you actually gain these extra points? Like, where do you start? Where do you go from here? So, firstly, the fundamentals and the key considerations are where you should start, but not with all of them. Pick a couple of these. Pick a couple of things. Like we talked about the idea of turn mapping. Focus on your use of equipment. Focus on just doing the math. Like, these are good places to start. Pick one or two if you're not already doing them, or if you are doing them, right? Like, you're a seasoned Fish and Blood player. You feel like you're pretty good at defense, but maybe it's starting to slip a little bit with the way the format's gone. Just, maybe in testing, maybe when you're playing at your local events, just start to focus on one or two things and see if you can, improve the efficiencies there. I know that's something that I'm personally thinking about as well. Self-reflection, I think, is important, right, Brendan? It's key to improving. So maybe you feel like you're not missing damage. Like, no, I don't leak damage. I never lose damage here or there. Maybe once every few games. Why not just ask a friend, ask a testing partner, do you think I'm losing damage here? Look back at a turn. Have a turn and then talk through it. Did I lose damage here? Did I have a better efficient turn here? I think is a good. I know we did that a lot in the last format. We would flip hands as these Viscerai decks when Scalata was around and be like, what was the most efficient play here?
That was very complicated.
Half an hour.
Yeah. Well, when you first started, it was very complicated, right? To find the literal most effective, especially when you start considering variants with snagging the Sonata a bit early or something like that, and also creeping in the Sonata when you don't have to get a second action point to hedge against something that doesn't have go again. It was really intense. Yeah. But you could actually sit there and just do all of the lines. It's the glory of DTS.
Probably don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but there's even in a game of limited, I often find it's actually there's this play here, could use the quell here or in this way or whatever. Take some time, when it comes to, I don't want to say slow play, definitely not, but on these defensive turns, especially if that's something that you're focusing on and trying to improve on, take a bit more time. Realistically, all your thinking should be done during your opponent's turn anyway, because whatever you decide to do on defense is you've decided what you're doing on offense already, because you've decided what you're doing with your hand. So take the time, make the decisions. If you're thinking on your opponent's turn and your turn, that's probably something to look at anyway. Basically 90% of what's happening in your thought process, maybe 80% depending on the deck you're playing, should be during your opponent's turn anyway. It should be pretty mapped out. So, take some time if you need to focus on those things, but obviously also be aware of, not slow playing. Play decks that focus on the defensive side, or a deck that needs to defend to gain some advantage off turns. So Guardians, Brutes, Warriors, I think are good examples of this. They have a lot of 3 blocks. Often they will take turn cycles off. They need to gain some advantage with their hand or set something up. So, they will defend with some or all of their hand in some certain situations and turns. I think these are good decks to jump on for practicing this sort of thing. Any other decks in your sort of frame of mind, Brendan?
No, I'll just give a non-future proof statement and say that in if you're going to the Pro Tour, if you're playing some of these big events coming up, and especially the limited, try to outquell your opponent. Try to turn some of those block 2s and block 3s, especially when they're redundant, and I think you'll win a lot more games, especially in 5 mirrors. It's very important.
Cool, good call. Understand that defending is a variable in the matchup. It won't always be crucial, but those 1s and 2s do add up. That's something I talked about before, and can really result in a win or a loss in a lot of cases. And just start to work out, if you save 1 or 2 damage, it is going to make a difference. I think having that mindset and that mind frame is really going to help. Every deck will have to defend over the course of 8 rounds. No one is immune, even if you're playing an aggro deck. You're going to brick a hand. You're going to need to defend at some point. Every deck needs to defend at some point in their lifetime. So work out the best way to defend when you do need to defend, even if you're playing a deck that doesn't need to defend very often.
We've got some combo 5 players that are a bit suspicious on that statement, but luckily they don't exist anymore. All right, so we do have a Google review this week, sir. But before I go into it, Hayden, why don't you tell people, if you want to get your review read out on Arsenal Pass, hear my voice, say your words, how do they do it?
They're all shutting off right about now. No, kidding. First of all, do just want to say, really enjoyed that sort of main topic, Brendan, talking about the defensive side of the game a bit more. Would love to get people's feedback on whether they find this helpful. Are these kind of things helpful that we focus on the pod? It's something that we did a lot back in the day, these kind of real fundamental focuses. And sometimes, we focus just more on the meta and what's happening. So would love to get your thoughts down in the YouTube comments of what you thought about this pod. If you do want to get your Google review in and have Brendan read it out with that smooth, silky voice, your words, his mouth, ratethispodcast.com/Arsenal Pass, and it'll take you to your preferred platform once you click on it, and you can leave a review. Reviews really help us out. They get us on these charts. They get visibility to Arsenal Pass for other potential Flesh and Blood players, or just players who aren't playing Flesh and Blood but maybe want to get into the game to find us and hear our voices. Plus, of course, we love a nice 5-star review and a cheeky few comments. So, Brendan, what have we got this week? I can see who the author is, and I can't wait.
Yeah, I love that my rough, smoky, just degenerate voice is smooth and silky to you. That does make me feel good. So for it coming out, we have some the title is Awesome Coverage of Everything Flesh and Blood, and the author is Badgersaurus. I think I might know who this is. Is this the man behind the Cognition Nodes deck? Because I've heard that thing is I'm scared of it in PT2. Let's say that. It says Arsenal Pass is not just the best fab podcast. Is not only the best fab podcast, not only the greatest online media production of all time, but it represents the high tide of human civilization and is certain to never be overtaken by any other endeavor. It is nice to hear two experts, one with a funny American accent and one with a normal voice, talk about everything there is to know about Fab TCG, and they even like Reinar. Full of robust discussion, healthy disagreement, and unhealthy die roll imbalances, Arsenal Pass is a must listen for the whole family, provided you live alone. My only scathing critique is that it should be called Pass Arsenal, because you pass priority in the main phase and then Arsenal in the end step. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a lot of rules confusion around this due to the irresponsible representation of the rules via the title of the podcast. That is true. People are actually, that's a funny thing, because people actually do get confused, because it's not because of the podcast, but Arsenal Pass is just a very popular thing to say in Flesh and Blood, but it is absolutely incorrect. You do pass and then Arsenal.
Very true. Well, thank you for that review, Badgersaurus, and we can only speculate on who it might be. Anyway, Brendan, as I say, if you do want to get your review and get them in, if you do want to get your questions in for the Command and Cookout, get them in as well. We're always looking for nice, juicy questions and things to dive into. Or if you have any suggestions for topics we should cover on the podcast, drop them below in the YouTube comments and let us know. Anyway, that's it for this week. Just last few things. If you do want to jump into Flesh and Blood Twitter, follow myself and Brendan on Twitter. We're both there at BrendanAPG and at Fian_Dale. You'll find us. Big shout out to all of our patrons again. And we will have our Patreon pod coming sometime this month, I think before the PT. If you're going to be at the Calling in Singapore, come and say hello. And if you're going to be in Lille, come and also say hello to us. Excited to play a busy few weeks of Flesh and Blood, but I love traveling for these events. I know you do too, Brendan. It's very exciting. So we'll see some of you soon, and for the rest of you, we'll see you next week.